Let me know if you have any questions about using your paintbrush, holding it, any of that. It's always good to have those basics down before we start into the actual lettering process. Today I want to give you some tips for actually just working with your paintbrush in general so that we can be ready to start doing letters and the basic strokes. So let's jump in. I'm going to give you a few tips. So the supplies that you'll need from your box, you're going to need your paintbrush, so you'll want that out. You're going to want your paint dot card handy, your workbook, and also grab out some of your watercolor paper. Everyone got a few scrap pieces. They might be, there were all different shapes, just some little scrap pieces that we had from cutting the paper down. But also you could just pull out one of these from your regular cards too, if you'd like to use these to practice on. And then you're also gonna need, I'm just pulled out this lid for my watercolor so I can pull the paint and then mix over here. And then of course I just have a jar of water and some paper towels. So that's everything that you're gonna need. And we're just gonna give you some basics for lettering with a paintbrush. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is get some paint over to my little palette area. So I'm just going to pull, I got my paintbrush wet, and I'm just going to put some of the paint over here, and I'm going to get more water to mix in. So these are some of the tips that Shelly taught us, that I'm just getting a little bit of paint over here. So we'll be ready to talk about using your paintbrush for lettering. So the first thing is where to even hold this brush as you're lettering. So I like to go a little bit like an inch above where the metal starts. So right about here, so it's where the metal and the wood meet. That's where I'm holding it as I'm doing this. The next thing is the angle that you're holding your pen. When you're using a brush pen, you really want to stick to that 45. But because this is a paintbrush, the tip is much more flexible than a brush pen, and it's actually quite a bit longer too than beginner brush pens would be. So you kind of want to change the angle a little bit depending on what type of stroke that you're doing. So let me give you two different ways that you can kind of hold your pen at an angle. So you can either have your hand resting on the surface, and then you'll be using more of the angle of your brush as you're going, or the other option, you can kind of hold your hand up so that it's not resting and more your arm is resting, and you're using the tip more this way. And it kind of depends, you're gonna find which one you prefer. And I know left-handed individuals may prefer holding the brush more upright like this, so their hand doesn't smear when you're going this way. If you're more upright, your hand won't smear across the ink. So there is more flexibility in the angle that you're holding your brush, and you're going to notice as we start doing the strokes, you're going to notice kind of how the angle will vary and what's going to feel most comfortable for you. So to start, we're going to do some of the exercises that a few of the exercises we did with Shelly. So we're going to get a little bit of paint onto our brush, and we're going to practice those leaves. So we're going to start with a thin line. We're going to press down for more pressure and then lift up back to thin. And so what we're doing here, we're just practicing going from thin to thick. And these don't need to be perfect. And this is just practice, just getting familiar with how the brush works. So they kind of look like little leaves. If we were to add a second portion to it, they would look more like a leaf. But we just want to get used to this feeling of light pressure, heavy pressure, back to light pressure before we start learning the basic strokes. So do a little bit of practice with these until you're feeling comfortable with moving from light pressure to heavy pressure to light pressure again. So you'll notice you want to do some practice where the strokes are longer, but you could also do some practice where the strokes are a little bit shorter, just to get the feel for that you know, heavy pressure, light pressure, and back and forth. So that's always an option too. So you can do this next exercise on one of the full papers, but there's also on the back of your workbook, there's some tracing paper. So you can grab a sheet of this out and you can do watercolor on this because we're just practicing, right? But this will be a good place to get a feel for our brush. So the other exercise that I just wanted to show you and to practice was just doing some ovals. Ovals are a shape that is all over in lettering. And so if we can just practice doing an oval and just going all the way around and just kind of get a feel, and then you can just fill it in. We're just kind of getting a feel for how the brush moves. And when we're coming to the top, I like to kind of push this way and then come down. And then I'm kind of pulling that way and then up. And we can kind of fill it in. And these don't need to look perfect by any means. We're just getting a feel for how the brush moves and how to manipulate it to make these shapes. Let's do one more. And you can do as many of these as you'd like to just kind of get familiar with your brush. Another exercise that we can try again is just trying to do really thin lines and just kind of stay thin and just make some little squigglies. And just practice getting that thin line and using light pressure. Because the biggest thing with brush lettering is that we're gonna be, anytime we're moving our pen or our brush in an upward direction, we're gonna be using light pressure. And anytime we're moving our paintbrush in a downward direction, we're gonna be using thick pressure. So we wanna be able to get those thin lines so we have some nice contrast between the thicker lines. So those are just a few. This is another one that's fun just for a warm up. It's just like a squiggle. But remember, anytime you're moving down, you're using heavier pressure. And you can see this one, the pressure on this is a lot less than this one. But it really doesn't matter as long as your light pressure is less than the heavy pressure, then it's fine. It doesn't have to be the super thin hairline. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be a little thicker and still be okay. So those are a few tips. Go ahead and practice those. Get familiar with your brush. In the next video, I'm going to be sharing how to do the basic strokes.